for this session coming up, we're going to look at how America has relied on the sea for economic prosperity over its history. It's done so in many complex and often undecipherable ways. And here to decipher those ways for us is our next speaker, Linwood Pendleton, Director of Ocean and Coastal Policy in the Nicholas Institute for the Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University. Linwood also, since January of 2011, has served as acting chief economist at NOAA. He also serves as a director of the Marine Ecosystem Services Partnership and works with United Nations Environment Program's Green Economy Project. His work focuses on policies that affect human use of the ocean, both for recreation and resources. And we're very honored to have Linwood here with us today. Linwood, please.
Thanks very much, and it's great to be here at CHOW. I stopped coming to CHOW for a little bit because it was too hot in June, but Jeb said if I came this year, he would make it cooler. It pays to be a friend of NOAA. Go ahead and start this first GIF if you can. As the Secretary referred to, the ocean has been an instrumental part of growth in the United States, and I was asked to come and talk about that growth. And we tend to think of growth in relatively limited terms. This is an image of population growth in the United States starting in 1790. And what you can see, I think not surprisingly, is that for a very long time, population growth was really concentrated on the coast. But not just on the coast, it's concentrated in specific pockets along the coast. So we see, of course, New England being heavily populated, our other coasts, the Great Lakes, having a very large population, and then Southern California and later the Northwest. This is in part because this is where our large ports were. And the Secretary of Commerce, Bryson, talked quite a bit about the importance of trade. These circles here represent the size and the amount of trade. The Secretary mentioned how many exports go out, but if you add up exports and imports, the number is quite large, over $1 trillion a year. When I look at this map, though, I don't see those circles. What I see is all the white parts that aren't circled. And these are the places where I think our relationship with the coast has been most complicated and has had the biggest impact, I think, in many ways on the culture and the people that live in the United States. And so what I want to do is spend some time talking about that and telling you a story. To do this, I crowdsourced this presentation. I sent out an email to about 60 people asking them to tell me a story about how the ocean has affected their culture or where they live or their town. And I said, tell me about things that you think people in Washington, D.C. don't know about. We spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C. talking about New Bedford. We spend a lot of time talking about oil drilling, but there's a whole lot going on the coast. So what I'm going to do over the next 40 minutes or so is walk you through these stories that were contributed to me. This list is just a list of the primary points of contact. And I think one of the things that you know here is that we're a community, and this is a network. And so these people are just the first nodes in this larger community, and they reached out very broadly to source these stories. So let's start with where we always start, which is extraction, okay? But when you think about extraction and the extractive economy of the United States, what you probably don't think about is that it began with Chinese immigrants in California in many ways, okay? Lots and lots of Chinese immigrants came to California initially for the gold rush, but as gold became more and more scarce, they were pushed to the sea, where they ended up finding abundant resources that were not being used by the European Americans living there, particularly abalones. And by the way, this story was sent to me by Todd Bragey and Linda Bentz. But it wasn't just abalones, it was shrimp and squid. And these were products for which there wasn't a large market in the United States, but there was still a huge market in China. So these Chinese immigrants created these fishing camps up and down the Central Coast. And in Monterey, At one time in Monterey, there were as many as 500 Chinese fishermen living there, collecting black abalone on low tide, drying them, and sending them off. Over time, of course, this led to some wealth being accumulated. There were shipyards building junks in California. And so with that wealth came some envy. And so a not too pleasant part of our history includes the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, at which time we moved all of these fishermen out of their coastal camps and into the cities and sent many of them home, which meant we were able to open these resources up to European Americans. So beforehand, there really wasn't much of a taste for abalone, but that quickly changed. And Europeans came in and started what the Chinese had begun in terms of collecting abalone, to the point where abalone was featured on many menus, including this menu here at Fisherman's Grotto. By the way, in inflation-adjusted terms, an abalone steak at the Fisherman's Grotto there cost $10. Today, an abalone steak costs about $75 if you get it at a good restaurant. Okay? And that's because abalone became part of the California culture. It was part of the recreational culture, part of the commercial fishing culture. And I know a lot of people, because I have spent, California is my second home, sitting out on boats in the Channel Islands, and people will say, gosh, you know, it used to be so great when we could just pick up all these abalones and eat them. And it's like, well, it was great for you, but not so great for me, because you can't do that anymore, with most species of edible abalones being threatened and black abalone being endangered. Okay? So this is a story of abalone being culturally important, but not always a good outcome in terms of our ability to manage these. Farther up the coast, there is a reef off of Oregon that, while you can't access it by running out at low tide, it's incredibly productive in terms of fish and species, and it's off of Port Orford. Now, the problem with Port Orford is it's the windiest spot in the Pacific 48 states. It doesn't have a river, and it doesn't have a harbor. But that didn't keep people from moving to Port Orford to fish. What they did, if you've been to Port Orford, you know, is built a pier and built a crane and built boats that are all between 30 feet and 40 feet. So they can run out to the reef and fish and haul their boats in every single night. And Port Orford has grown up around this sort of smaller scale extractive resource, to the point where 30% of the jobs in Port Orford still are directly tied to the commercial fishing industry. This was provided by Lisa Cobb. Okay. If you go back further, though, Porter Hoagland sends this story in about extraction on Cape Cod, which began with salt. Okay? Not all the things we extract are things we cook and eat. Some of them are things that we sprinkle on things we eat. So it turns out that very early on in Cape Cod, back in the 1830s, or even earlier than that, there were as many as 1,200 windmills up and down Cape Cod whose primary purpose was to pump salt water up into ponds to be evaporated. Now, the reason there were 1,200 windmills was that there were government subsidies to do this. And it was because there weren't good sources of salt. We needed salt to dry and salt fish, bacalao and cod, pollock. We needed it for furs. And so these salt windmills really were the critical piece of infrastructure in New England that led to a lot of that development that you saw in the first slide. Grist mills were also run by wind power. But of course, in the mid-1800s, salt was found in saline springs in Virginia and Kentucky, and it became cheaper and easier to get salt directly from those salt springs. So these windmills eventually died and ended up in the yards of rich people because they thought they were so wonderful to look at. Now, today we've come full circle, right? And we have windmills again off of Cape Cod, or they're about to come in. But we have a very different relationship with these windmills, at least in terms of their aesthetic. There are lots of things that we can extract from below the tides that we don't eat, but that are still important. So you guys know what this is? It's Ed Ricketts' shop, okay, in Monterey, California. Ed Ricketts, of course, really became one of the first big businesses to, and big businesses relative, but he became the major supplier of intertidal organisms that were used in middle schools and high schools across the country, all sorts of species. And in addition to collecting these organisms and making them available so students could learn about anatomy and ecology, Ed wrote this great book, Between Pacific Tides, which really opened the door for comparative ecology. Okay? So once again, this kind of extraction that we're talking about here, it's non-human consumptive, you're not eating it, but it's purely extractive, has taken place around the country and continues to be an important part of the way we use the ocean. Incidentally and unfortunately, Doc Ricketts exported a lot of red-legged frogs, and we know how that worked out in California. But not all of the things we extract from oceans and coasts and estuaries come from beneath the tides. Waterfowl and duck hunting has been incredibly important in our history and in our culture. These slides are sent to me by Louis Lawrence, who is a coastal planner in Middlesex, Virginia. This is off the Chesapeake Bay, but it could be Morro Bay, where people still shoot brants. It could be eastern North Carolina, where people shoot loons. And when I talk to people about how do you get things done in eastern North Carolina, I always tell them, if you can tie it to ducks or fish, people will do it. Okay? A very important part of culture and why people live in eastern North Carolina is because they like to hunt. And that's also true of the Gulf of Mexico and a lot of other places. Okay. Now, one of the annual rituals in duck hunting, part of the cycle of nature, is build blinds and curtains, hunt from them, and then wait for the storms to knock them down and build them back again. But this is a rite of passage, and it's just part of the culture of the Chesapeake Bay and other places. Like most extractive uses of the ocean, though, it's multifaceted. So these guys aren't out there just shooting ducks. They're out there spending time in the water with unbelievable views. There, Louis eating an oyster that he just pulled off of a rock, spending time with his dog. So when we did work in the Channel Islands, we went out and we were trying to separate people into consumptive users and non-consumptive users. There are very few people that fall in those two categories. There's a mix. And this is just a great example of how that mixture matters. But Don Davis sends us this. Shooting birds is not just recreational. Shooting birds was big business in the Gulf of Mexico, okay, where 1,000 brace of ducks, and so a brace can be, I've read, anywhere between 2 and a bunch, were shipped out of the Gulf each week, going to New Orleans and Baton Rouge, where it was an important source of meat in the local markets, but also in restaurants. That's where people got their daily requirements of lead, I suppose. But it wasn't just ducks. But by the way, look at the size of those shotguns. I mean, those are cannons. Okay? It wasn't just ducks, it was hunting and trapping. So another slide from Don Davis. As many as 150,000 people used to move to the marsh in Louisiana every summer to trap. And to do this, what you see is the canal here. I can't point to it on either side. That canal. We often give the oil companies a hard time for cutting these canals through the marshes so they can get into the refinery plants. But the first canals that were cut, to a large degree, were cut so people could get into the marshes and hunt. So we've been cutting canals in that marsh for a long time. It's part of the way people thought you used marshes, and it goes back a long way. But this 150,000 people gave rise to entire support communities and a whole way of life. Now, very closely associated with extraction, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, is that the sea is tied to our culture and who we think we are. And in some cases, who we think we are depends directly on extraction. And nowhere is that more true than in Alaska, where salmon fishing still continues to be a very important part of the culture. It's an opportunity every year for people to move down to the fishing camps where you can learn how to process fish, but it also is just a great way of keeping young people engaged with the traditions of their ancestors. These slides were provided by Sima Eben of Sea Grant. And Sima also points out that it's not just in Alaska. A lot of times we think, oh, these things happen far away from our normal daily lives, but it happens in Puget Sound too. Okay, so these are the Squaxin tribe celebrating the beginning of the year salmon celebration. Probably happened now or just recently as the salmon start to run. And what the Squaxin have done is they've started inviting members of the outside community, non-Squaxin, to come and participate. And by doing so, they're not only leveraging the sort of tourism power of this, but they're really making a connection to the broader community, because it's all of us that has to take care of, manage the ocean. And if benefits are restricted to just a few, it makes it much more difficult. Perhaps less charismatic but equally iconic is shrimp in the southeastern United States. And originally, shrimp in the Charleston area were considered net fowlers, things that people didn't want. But the African immigrants who lived in Charleston started catching shrimp any way they could. And I know I'm going to keep forgetting, but this was sent to me by Susan Lovelace and Tricia Ryan and Brian Smith of NOAA. And what they're pointing out here is that these shrimp were edible and delicious. And the early African immigrants would sell them on the street as swimpies, calling swimpy, and they would sell these and make money on the side. And of course, this has grown into an integral part of South Carolina and North Carolina culture. When I moved to Durham, they told me shrimp and grits was invented in Durham, North Carolina. Sure. But you can see here by 1847, shrimp and grits was in the Carolina Housewife, so every good homemaker knew how to cook shrimp and grits. And you can't go to a restaurant in Charleston or eastern North Carolina without eating shrimp and grits. But the connection between culture and the sea is not all about extraction. In this case, it's about rice in South Carolina. When Tricia and Susan and Brian said they wanted to submit a slide about rice, I said, well, it's got to be about the ocean. And it turns out, in this case, it is. In the 1630s, the English settled Charleston, and they were having a really hard time of it, because it's hard to grow stuff in the low country. It's too salty and too wet to grow the things that people were used to growing in England. So the African immigrants there said, well, what about rice? And they brought rice with them. And they used the tides to push fresh water back up into trunks that then they could use to distribute and irrigate the land. So you can see over here in the upper left corner, these sort of paddies, southeastern rice-style paddies. And by doing that, it gave Charleston an agricultural industry that really helped fuel the survival of that colony. Now, it wasn't just about rice, but the same African immigrants there used tides to power the rice mills. So we talk about tidal power as it's this great new thing. They've been doing it in South Carolina since 1630, and it was the African immigrants who taught us how to do it. Now, by the way, as rice agriculture became less profitable, the people who own these rice plantations continued to hold them in estates and eventually put much of them in conservation easements, which later became the Ace Basin National Estuary Research Reserve. So you want to talk about something that's still living. The legacy of rice in South Carolina has a lasting impact today. The Ace Basin is one of the most beautiful places on the East Coast. This is Thunder Bay. Okay. And this is a slide that's provided to us by the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary that shows, I showed that first image of that big dot in the middle of the country. Well, part of that big dot was driven by a maritime commerce 1,000 miles from the sea. Okay? And that maritime commerce, that, you know, our other ocean, the Great Lakes, really had an amazing impact on Midwestern culture. It gave us an option of having a maritime culture in a place that was otherwise quite different. And the canals there, which you could not transit just through locks, but you still could connect to the rest of the world and the ocean-going world, really helped connect this maritime industry to the rest of the country's growing coastal economy. Another slide from Don Davis is about the cultural heterogeneity of the bayou country of Louisiana. We always talk about the Cajuns, and the Cajuns are obviously a very important part of the bayou country. But if you look closely in the bayou country, what you'll find is that there are relatively persistent communities of Irish and Italian and Austrians and Germans and Greeks and Isleños, and it goes on and on. Laotians, Portuguese, Malaysians. It's incredibly diverse, and it continues to be diverse. But it's something that we often overlook. And you can't just count on a name, because through intermarriage, there are Cajuns and Acadians who have the last name of Smith, and Irish who have the last name of Chenier. It's an incredibly diverse and important part of that community, and it's one of the reasons it has been so resilient even in the face of incredible weather challenges. Now, not all culture starts off on a bright note. You don't think Eastern North Carolina and Somalia have much in common, but Eastern North Carolina got its start through piracy. And it was the home of Blackbeard, Edward Teach. Until about 1718, it was a big-time place to be a pirate. Anne Bonny was there, all sorts of pirates. In 1718, Edward Teach scuttled the Queen Anne's Revenge right in the mouth of Beaufort Inlet. We don't know why. Some people think he did it to get rid of his crew. It was a layoff tactic. But he did, and it's there. And we didn't know about it for a very long time until 1995 when a storm uncovered it. Since then, with the help of NOAA in the state of North Carolina, we've been learning more about the Queen Anne's Revenge, and it has become a really important part of the identity of tourism and recreation in Beaufort, and I'll come back to that. But piracy, even in its dolled-up Walt Disney version, still is an important part of the way Beaufort thinks of itself. And you still have pirate walks, and we have the annual pirate invasion, and it's just part of everything we do in Beaufort. Okay. Let's talk about recreation, because for some reason it still escapes me, the Millennium Assessment decided that recreation and culture were the same thing. So gives us a natural reason to move into recreation. And maybe they weren't so far off, because I mentioned that Queen Anne's Revenge. Well, the Queen Anne's Revenge is not the only thing to sink off of Beaufort. Okay? There are loads of wrecks off of Beaufort, just as there are in Thunder Bay. And in a habitat that is largely soft bottom and sandy, if not muddy, these wrecks have really been a place to see lots of big fish, especially sharks, but a place for divers to cut their teeth on nitrox and spend some time just below the sea. These pictures are from Mike Gherkin. They're just amazing. This is the spar and the U-352. Just another view. Loads and loads of tiger sand sharks there. It's a great place to have a shark experience. Now, surfing, of course, is an important part, and I've asked Chad Nelson to tell us a little bit about how surfing has affected San Clemente. So go ahead and start this audio for us.
This is the surf at Upper Trestles at San Onofre State Beach in the town of San Clemente, California. Trestles is arguably the best surfing area in California and the only place that regularly hosts an ASP World Tour surfing event in the United States. Trestles has attracted surfers to San Clemente for decades, and as a result, San Clemente is a center of the surf industry, hosting numerous surfboard shapers, the Surfrider Foundation, the Surfing Heritage Museum, and is the birthplace of many top-tier professional surfers. The waves at Trestles attract surfers from throughout Southern California, who contribute to San Clemente's local economy by spending money in the town when they visit. They buy gas, eat at local restaurants, and shop in local stores. The state park keeps careful count of visitation at Trestles and estimates that over 300,000 surfers visit Trestles each year. Based on a study that I did, we know that 83% of the surfers who visit Trestles come from outside the city of San Clemente and contribute between $8 and $13 million a year to the local economy. These surfers have a lot of choices about where they surf, but they are drawn to Trestles for the natural setting and the high-quality waves.
The biggest expenditure, since I worked with Chad on that study, the biggest expenditure by surfers? Breakfast. And it makes a difference. When we tried to do surfing studies in other places, they said, oh no, we'll fund artisanal fishing studies. I said, but there are only 2 artisanal fishers, and you've got 50,000 surfers coming here a year. The story Chad told could have been about Santa Cruz, could have been Rincon, Puerto Rico, could have been about the North Shore of Hawaii or Cocoa Beach, Florida. It's not isolated, and we could tell the same stories about windsurfing and all sorts of recreational uses. Beach volleyball is another area that's quintessentially beach-related in California. It started between Manhattan Beach and East Beach in Santa Barbara. It gave rise to a whole culture that we know that characterized California for a very long time. And I asked Mike DeLappa, who, when I asked him, I did not know about his pedigree in professional beach volleyball, to just provide some of these slides and give a short narration of this, which he passed off to John Lee, who is a very famous professional volleyball player. So we have just a short bit of audio here, and I'm just going to say, let this be a lesson to you. This is what you get when you ask a volleyball player to describe volleyball. Go ahead.
Beach volleyball was once a well-kept Southern California secret, a product of the Pacific Ocean and the people it inspired. In the 1960s, small enclaves of beach devotees gave rise to a large subculture that relished the athleticism the sport required. Moving and jumping for hours in the deep sand, the subtlety and the power, the purity and the simplicity of a sandy skirt of California coast that hosted the games, and the vast ocean that oversaw it all. Ambitious, powerful athletes, both men and women, became heroes known only to those initiated into the mystics of the sport. Intense athletic drama animated weekend tournaments wherever the sea had deposited an expanse of sand, from Santa Cruz to San Diego, in Santa Barbara, Santa Monica, Manhattan Beach, Laguna, and Mission Beach. Beach volleyball embodied a free-form lifestyle with few cameras, regulations, or paychecks, and it captured the imaginations of thousands of players and fans. It was a wholly California phenomenon. Today, the secret is out. The sport has become the hottest ticket at the Summer Olympics. The world now embraces what was once purely American. The spirit of the Pacific has spread to the beaches of the Atlantic Ocean, the Mediterranean, and the Sea of China. From wherever the ocean meets the land, and even places where it doesn't, beach volleyball has become a worldwide phenomenon. American players like Misty May and Kerry Walsh, Todd Rogers and Phil Dalhouser have become international superstars, won gold medals, and lots of money. But they all began with the same motives: to rule the beach, to spend a day of exercise and fierce competition on the sand, with friends and fans to share it all, and then a dip in the infinite ocean to soothe and to celebrate.
Now, I always thought they were just playing volleyball. I had no idea they were down there writing poetry. But beach volleyball is important, and the Rand Corporation was able to attract people to Santa Monica because they could play volleyball in the afternoon. That was a calling card. And then go swimming. So it's just amazing how important recreation is to the economic development of some of these coastal economies. But it's not just California. Of course, it's everywhere. It could be Orchard Beach, Maine. Here, Don Davis provides some pictures of second home lots on the Gulf of Mexico and Louisiana, Holly Beach, and Grand Isle, where they were hawking, bathing, fishing, dancing, and good eating 100 years ago. Okay? The tarpon were huge. Let's move on to art, and I'm going to go a little bit more quickly here. But the sea has also been incredibly important in the development of art and as an inspiration for art. And of course, art is also part of commerce. These pictures are by my former student and current colleague, Kristen Mays of the St. John in the Virgin Islands. It's a diptych of Leinster Bay. But she grew up right outside of the national park, taking park walks with the rangers. And it gave her this love of the ocean that she's been able to turn into art. It's another painting by her. But it's many people who came on vacation and stayed because the vistas are incomparable. And it's the entire ecosystem, including people. George Sumner from the West Coast is someone who had a sort of a different relationship with the sea, spending a lot of time with marine mammals. This is, I think, Pescadero Beach. But it was George Sumner's painting of two dolphins that he called the Peacemaker, which got Mikhail Gorbachev's attention when he visited Stanford and led to a lifelong relationship between the two, where the sea was used as a paradigm and these two dolphins as the peace that was emerging between the Soviet Union and the United States. And of course, not all the art that comes from the sea is visual. There's just an abundance of literature that comes from the sea. And there's also a lot of trashy novels. And I grew up reading Travis McGee novels. And there was a guy in the Travis McGee novels, Travis McGee, who lived on a boat and did just enough work to get by so he could be on vacation. And I thought, that's what I'm going to do. Okay. I want to just take a little bit of time to talk about California specifically. I mentioned it's my second home. My first real job was there. I lived there for 10 years. And Sean Anderson of Cal State Channel Islands sent some pretty interesting slides that I've augmented. But when I first took my job at the University of Southern California, all of my friends from the Bay Area said, friends don't let friends go to Southern California. We always think that the divide in California is Northern California versus Southern California. But it isn't really so much. It's inland versus coastal. And we think of the coast as being Annette and Frankie and surfing and beach volleyball, but it really is so much more than that. My friend Ted Ballesteri is here. He's going to talk about this a little bit more. But World War I really pushed California to become a more commercial fishing sort of place. And it was the need for sardines, especially as packed by Portola, that gave rise to a sardine fishery in Monterey, attracting people from all over the world, but primarily Italian Americans moved down to Monterey to do this. The sardines eventually swam away and were caught, but that doesn't mean life in Monterey ended. And of course, you now know that Monterey has really been able to leverage its history as a cannery and a canning location, a place where canning was really important, to be so much more than that. And today, 4 million people a year visit Monterey Bay, with almost 2 million people making visits to the aquarium. What people don't realize, though, is that Monterey is not the only big-time fishing harbor in California. This is the Fisherman's Memorial in San Pedro, California, in Los Angeles. And commercial fishing in San Pedro began with about 3,000 Japanese families. Over time, that fishery grew. In 1892, the Southern California Fishing Corporation invented the first canning process. Back then, they were canning mostly sardines and mackerel. People didn't like to eat tuna, especially bluefin, because they thought it was a yucky sport fish. If only they kept that same taste. But over time in San Pedro, the tuna industry caught on. World War I, just like it did in Monterey, pushed the industry forward. And it drew people down from Northern California. Sicilian Americans came down to start opening processors and canneries. Italians, mostly from the island of Ischia, Ischitani, came to San Pedro in Southern California. I met two old guys who grew up on the same block in Ischia, or the same neighborhood in Ischia, never knew each other till their parents dragged them to San Pedro, California, where they both worked on the same fishing boat. But it wasn't just the Ischitani there, it was also the Croats. And Bogdanovich was one of the early processors, and if you know the name Bogdanovich, it's probably from the movies. Peter Bogdanovich went on to become a great director. But the Bogdanovich family invented the power block, that giant pulley on the back of a purse seine boat that has made modern purse seining viable. It grew, the fishing industry grew to the point where Los Angeles was the biggest fishing harbor in the United States. That's not what comes to mind when most people think of fishing. Or Los Angeles, 13 million pounds of tuna were being pulled out of the Los Angeles environs a year in the 1950s. Starkist was there, French's Sardines, Franco-Italian company. Los Angeles was also a whaling harbor. Not a lot of people know about that. And a sport fishing harbor. And so these are parts of Los Angeles that tend to be outside of our recent memory when we think about this. And one of the reasons is that many of the places where we used to do whaling and where we used to go to the beach in the San Pedro area, like Brighton Beach, are gone. And they're gone because they were pushed out by commercial fishing development. And we didn't really think about protecting things like Brighton Beach or this whaling history. This is Malibu, where sport fishing has always been important. That's why we had the pier. The pier wasn't there so you could go out and see surfers or shoot the pier if you were a surfer. The pier was there so you could fish. If you want to read about sport fishing in Southern California, you've got to get this book by Ed Reese. It's called The Golden Years of Fishing. And it's got pictures of ladies in petticoats and men in three-piece suits pulling up 200-pound cowcod and black sea bass from the pier right off of Santa Monica. That's not what you're catching today, okay? You're lucky if you're catching mackerel. Now, the sea doesn't just shape people, it shapes the coast, and that's why we end up in the places we do. So I just want to quickly go through some of these. Heather Triesenberg provided these shots. This is really about a guy named Charlie Mears, who in 1837, at the age of 23, ended up in Michigan and just saw thousands of acres of gigantic white pines. But there was no one around who needed them. But Charlie bought all the land up and built 5 harbors around the Great Lakes, and brought in boats and started timbering and shipping these trees out to the East Coast and to farther south near Chicago area, where cities and towns were growing and there was a high demand for this. Never would have happened without this sort of accident of geography. This is Beaufort again, but the reason it's here is because of Cape Lookout. Once again, another accident of geography. Cape Lookout sticks way out into the ocean, but it's not very deep, and so it's a place where fish congregate, and whales came very close to shore. So people lived in Shackelford Island, primarily to whale initially, while Blackbeard was in Beaufort, offshore, just 300 feet, were little villages that were devoted almost entirely to whaling. Now, the other thing that these shoals did was they wrecked a lot of ships, and that's why Beaufort is in the center of what we now know as the graveyard of the Atlantic. And that's given rise to dozens and dozens of small charter industries, like Captain Roseman's Tortuga charter here, that takes people out to the wrecks. But it's also an incredibly abundant place for bird life because of the abundant sea life. Joel Gore gave us this slide of the Great Marsh, which was founded in 1634, primarily because it was a great place to hay, where you could hay the salt marsh, especially the cordgrass. That hay let you have livestock, and at the same time, they could clam and crab and it gave rise to a whole community there, the largest estuary north of Manhattan, New York. The Inside Passage is also known as Whale Channel, and so Gary Davis from the Channel Islands National Park provides this slide of whales. So this is a great place for people to get to see whales because they're highly concentrated moving through this channel. Bioluminescent Bay in Puerto Rico, where tannins from the mangroves provide this nutrient that dinoflagellates use, and they become blue when agitated. It's just a phenomenal accident of nature that has become a primary sustainer for the local economy there. Another is Hurricane Hole in St. John. Hurricane Hole is one of the few places to get out of the weather when the weather is bad in the Virgin Islands. But the problem is that people were tying up to the mangroves and pulling mangroves up during hurricanes, destroying the habitat there. So the national park worked with sailors, many of them liveaboards, to put in moorings. Okay? And so now we're able to maintain the mangroves, which are so important to having the Hurricane Hole really function, but we can still use them. So that's this great cooperative approach to using a resource for everyone's benefit. This is an inlet at Wells Reserve. Inlets, whether created by storms or in the case of Elkhorn Slough by bulldozers and tractors and shovels, have been places where we've congregated because you can see marine life just inside the inlet without risking life and limb being out in the surf. But of course, they're quite ephemeral. There are other places, though, where nature wasn't so obliging and people created their own inlets. And so in this case, we have an example provided by the Dismal Swamp. Donna Stewart provided this, where slaves in 1793 cut a channel from the Chesapeake down to the Albemarle Sounds. And then when they did that, what it did is it let people get around Cape Lookout, that graveyard of the Atlantic, so more people could use the northern parts of the Atlantic coast and the southern part without putting themselves at risk. And so now it's a great thoroughfare. Some people call it the Highway 66 of boating. And it led to entire maritime industries in places like Elizabeth City, North Carolina, which is hundreds of miles from the sea, but had boat building shops and canneries. And now Elizabeth City hosts boating. If you've ever tied up in Elizabeth City like I have, you know if 3 or more transient boats tie up in any one evening, people appear out of nowhere and have what they call the Rose Party, which is cheap wine, bad cheese, and old crackers. But it's a big fancy party right there on the waterfront. Okay, part of their culture. Now, the reason we still have some of these places to visit is in large part because of the national parks and sanctuaries. And I just want to touch on a small handful of those. This is a movie, so you can go ahead and start that really quickly.
For just a moment, close your eyes and imagine this. Imagine crystal clear turquoise waters glistening in the afternoon sun, lapping against the velvety white beach. Imagine a sky of pelicans and frigate birds swooping and gliding above a submerged world. Underwater forests of living coral, dazzling schools of fish, and great sea turtles swimming and breathing in a quiet, liquid realm. Imagine a land steeped in a rich cultural legacy, from swashbuckling pirates to Danish sugar plantations, to a mysterious early people.
I'm going to go ahead and skip that because we're running out of time. You can see the full movie on the blog. I'll tell you about it at the end. But there are lots of marine sanctuaries, but some of them really are incredibly devoted to protecting culture. These are photographs from the Gray's Reef Marine Sanctuary in Georgia. And the Gray's Reef, of course, is an important place for Gullah Geechee culture, and really was the result of Sam Gray's discovery with the help of Geechee people to find the reef off the coast. Thunder Bay has more than 200 pristine or nearly pristine wrecks that are there from that maritime history I told you about, and it's a wonderful place to go visit that. As the secretary was saying, it really has driven commerce to the area. Stellwagen Bank, just want to point out that it was as early as 1616 that John Smith noted the fishery resources of Stellwagen Bank. Continues to be one of the most concentrated commercial fishing industry sort of activity places in all of the Gulf of Maine. And it's in a marine sanctuary. But it's not just fish, of course, it's whales. And while the Stellwagen got its start as a place to kill whales, in the 70s and 80s, the whale watching business really took off and was instrumental in the founding of that National Marine Sanctuary. The Hawaiian Humpback Whale Sanctuary is another place, and while it has whale in the title, it has a lot of culture that's protected there, particularly this idea of kapu, which is really the first. It's the Hawaiian version of a marine sanctuary that still continues to be important. And finally, I want to end with Papahanaumokuakea, not because it has a lot of people, but because I wanted to say it. But it does have some cultural importance. I have 1 minute, so I want to get to, I think, the most important slide, which is not this one. This is important. These are the people from the sanctuaries who contributed those slides. But it's this slide. And as we go through this week, what I want you to keep in mind is that we tend to think of growth and value in very narrow terms. And I think if you have growth without diversity, the way I've described diversity, you don't have prosperity. You don't have a resilient coast. You have more of what I think of as sprawl. What we need to do is when we think of value, we've got to get way beyond GDP. We've got to get way beyond revenues. It's got to be much more broad and inclusive and include natural capital values, ecosystem values, cultural values, and historic values. So if I can leave you with one thing to start the rest of this week, it's that. And I will, since I received so many amazing slides and narrative, I will be posting these over the course of the next year at this website. So you can see the whole movie, but you can see all the other great slides that were sent to me. Thank you very much. And since you're in the dark, you can say anything you want. I won't know who it was. We done? Oh, take some questions. I can't see your hands. Okay.
How do you reconcile values that you're trying to describe with this set of values that enter into the equation of how we make? How do you reconcile?
Well, the first thing is we have to understand that people are motivated by more than money. Right? We often, when we talk about these coastal uses, we make this arbitrary distinction between lifestyle and livelihood. And we do that to say so commercial fishing is somehow more important than these other things, or oil extraction is somehow more important than other things. And I think everyone here knows someone who has decided to make a sacrifice in their career or in how much money they earn so they can live by the coast. So that's a start. We can start to put values on the way people use these resources through a variety of ways. And people often talk about ecosystem service valuation as being relatively young or novel. It's not. We've been doing it for almost 50 years now. And we have pretty good ways of doing that. The President's Council for Advisors in Science and Technology put out a report just this year on sustaining environmental capital that provides some very good steps in moving that way. And the World Bank today issued its second only environmental strategy that includes wealth accounting, especially for the oceans, coral reefs, and other community uses. So you got to start thinking about that. And it's not a zero-sum game. So it's not oil or culture. It's trade-offs. And the Center for Ocean Solutions has got a great guide on how do you start thinking about trade-offs. There are tools to start thinking about trade-offs and start quantifying trade-offs. But this is the kind of thing that we have to do. This is where marine spatial planning is supposed to take us. It's thinking about the big picture. It's not just growing tourism. It's not just growing exports. It's maintaining the value of this combined cultural, historical, recreational, and market economy. The other thing I want to say that I didn't mean to say is I don't think we're going to be able to do a good job of that until we get beyond this thinking that says a commercial fishing job is somehow more important than other kinds of ocean-dependent jobs. Surfing jobs are important, recreational fishing jobs are important, bird watching jobs are important, tourism jobs are important. There wouldn't be a second home industry in eastern North Carolina if people couldn't get out into the salt marsh, into the ocean. And all these are important. And so we have to stop creating these false categories that we say, this is important and all these other things are play. We have to take them all seriously. Billy.
Thank you very much for first taking the bold step to go down pointing out the extraction and all the uses of the resources that are out there. And I thought it was really bold of you to talk about duck hunting and the culture that surrounds that in coastal communities. In National Marine Sanctuaries, we are multiple use managed areas. We are very special areas, very special places. But we also have groups that think we should not promote extraction. And we have people that think we shouldn't be there because we think we don't promote extraction. How do we blend those? And I think it's some of what you just said, but give us some courage.
Well, so where I live in New Hampshire, I don't think people should be allowed to snowmobile because I like to cross-country ski and they sometimes run me down. But I don't make all the decisions. And so everybody has different preferences. And so what you're talking about now is a political and social process. The economic information I talked about helps us make these decisions, and it helps us get beyond my use is more important than your use. But ultimately, we have to sit down and we have to recognize that some of the things we do have negative impacts on others, and there are ways of limiting that so that we can all be happier. There are certain cases, and I think the Queen Anne's Revenge is one, where you can't have unlimited diving. I had some divers say, I don't know why they're keeping us out of the Queen Anne's Revenge when they don't know with 100% certainty that it really is Blackbeard's ship. And I said, well, can't we give them 5 or 10 years to see if this 250-year-old ship is? Because if we don't, it won't be there in 5 or 10 years. And they said, yeah, okay, now that you put it that way. So I think it really is this, we have to move beyond, I'm taking this for my use only, and get to the point where we recognize that all these things have value. And there's more to job creation than the number of jobs. It's the quality of jobs. And people aren't going to live in a lot of these coastal areas just because of a job. They've got to have access to these other things that they also value.
There are some things that have sort of gone over the top. What is this love affair you have with beaches?
The other affair we have with beaches?
And it's gone to the point, again, in my opinion, where the other values of beaches, like particularly, let's say, biodiversity, things like this, get overwhelmed by all of the uses we like to put to beaches. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could have a national beach policy, kind of like we have a national wetlands policy? What do you think of this little content we have?
Well, I mean, personally, I think we did have a beach act at one point that I don't believe is extant now. But a lot of these issues are protecting sort of local interests versus national interests. So the ecosystem diversity of a beach it tends to be something that people care about beyond the local realm, and that's why it gets overlooked. It's not that we don't know what happens. There are people at University of California at Santa Barbara. What's the woman there who studies? Jenny Dugan, who is doing great work on this. We know about the value of this. I showed a picture here, I didn't point out the Grunion runs in Southern California. Very important, very iconic. But people don't realize the impact they have when they play volleyball. When we clean the beach, right? We rake the beach every day in Southern California. We don't realize what impacts that has on these other things. And so part of this is opening up the conversation so people realize what they're doing, to talk about ways of protecting ecosystem services that don't impinge upon people. But there are always going to be things that we do that require significant restrictions in people's activities, like protecting plover nesting areas. And that's just a societal trade-off. But we tend to manage beaches as if they're just local resources, and it's not true. There are important local aspects of beach use, But there are many others, particularly the ecosystem services, that are beyond local use.
It's time.
Good?
Go.
Okay, thank you very much.